Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the invitation and giving me the possibility to give a talk about ideas for the dairy industry in Northwest Europe for the upcoming 1 or 2 decades. And the topic is ecological intensification and dairy production systems towards specialized or integrated systems in Northwest Europe. Well, the background for my talk is the challenge for the European dairy systems, which I give as a short overview in the introduction. And then I want to introduce to our research project, grass-based dairy systems on the experimental farm Lindhof. And I will end up with a conclusion. You do see here the publication which is related to this talk in Frontiers and Sustainable Food Systems is online since the end of May, and it's more or less the same title as it's given here. Well, what is the background we do have in Northwest Europe, in the dairy industry of Northwest Europe? If we look back to the last 2 or 3 decades, we faced more and more specialization also in dairy systems, not anymore mixed farming systems, more and more specialized towards dairy. And that's ending up in the situation where we do have a lot of additional nitrogen in the system, ending up in a total nitrogen surplus of around 100 kilogram all over Germany. And if we look then to the situation in Northwest Europe, we do face the situation that we do have around a nitrogen surplus of 200 kilogram in the dairy industry per hectare and around 60 kilogram in the arable system, specialized in these surroundings. And that means if you add all this surplus with the social costs related to that, that means that the Northwest European agriculture has a burden of around 1,000 euro per hectare of social costs, which are not related to those people who are introducing this surplus. And due to this high surplus, which is directly linked to animal husbandry, we can say that some 75% of the surplus is directly linked to animal husbandry and also directly linked to environmental pollution. This induces dramatical social costs, and that means we have to discuss about ecological intensification in dairy farming, also in Northwest Europe. So what does it mean? If we talk about ecological intensification, you all do know the publications from Tintonel and all the others, and we will hear him also during this workshop later on. And I tried to give that as a schematic presentation here, though if we do have on the if we do see an input on the x-axis and the output on the y-axis, we do the typical yield function. And most of our agriculture in Northwest Europe is somewhere here in this situation. We do have a very, very small yield gap, and we do have the problems with environmental pollution. And that means that we have to look for strategies toward de-intensification in terms of ecological intensification, while Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, has to intensify to produce more. So if we talk about these different terms, ecological or sustainable intensification, I argue that we need in Northwest Europe mostly de-intensification towards a new optimum of common goods. So that means not only producing feed and food, but also clear water, reduced greenhouse gas emissions, and more biodiversity. So that's the situation we are in, and that means science has to look for options towards this ecological intensification. What does it mean in countries or states like the Netherlands and Germany? We do have a lot of permanent grassland. And permanent grassland is mostly the source for the dairy industry. And in the past, we always could argue that this is a good thing because we do not have a feed-food competition from this grassland because it's mostly not suitable for arable cropping. But in the last decade, it became more and more clear that this grassland does have also many shades of gray regarding ecosystem services. And the reason is that in Germany, and it's the same situation in the Netherlands, around 20 to 25% of this grassland is located on peat soils. And these are drained peat soils, and they emit a huge bulk of greenhouse gas emissions, and that's related to climate change. And that means we do face now not a feed-food competition from these dairy systems on the peat soils, but we face a land use competition in the form of food climate protection competition. And if you do see the figures here on the right side from our group, which we're measuring in a peaty soil, which is a basis for dairy production in the very north of Germany, where I'm from. So I'm here from this region, from Schleswig-Holstein, and we measured the typical situation, grass-based dairy systems for dairy. And we do find that we do have some 16 to 17 megagrams of CO2C equivalents. That means in total, some 50 tons of CO2 equivalents per hectare. And that means that this additional emissions from the peat soils makes factor 3 to factor 4 in terms of carbon footprint of the dairy product. And that means if you look forward, that while dairy systems based on permanent grassland fulfill the ecosystem services in Europe, in the Alps and in the foothills, on mineral soils, they fail in many lowland areas with peat and peaty soil. And that means if we do face now the situation in Europe with upcoming CO2 taxes or something else like taxes or costs for CO2 emissions, that means that this sites are not anymore competitive for dairy if you look forward for another 1 or 2 decades. So we do have around 1 million hectares of peat soils in Germany, and 1/4 of the dairy herds are standing on these soils. And that means how to compensate for this foreseeable lack of forage areas for dairy systems in Germany and in the Netherlands as well. And then we come to the other specialized systems. The other specialized systems are the arable farming systems. And we do also face huge problems in this type of arable farming, because we do not see anymore a significant increase on on-farm yields since more than 2 decades. You do see here the figure for the German figures of winter wheat, winter barley, and winter oilseed rape, per specialized arable cropping with a very, very close crop rotations with very, very few crops. And you do see only oscillation, but not any significant yield increment, while the breeders are offering yield increment every year for these 3 crops in a range of 1 to 2% significantly documented. That means we do see, due to this non-existing increment, we do see an increment of a yield gap regarding the yield potential and the real yields on the farms. And that means, from my perspective, that the current narrative, which is very often given in agricultural science, that technical solutions, so-called agriculture 4.0, within specialized cash crop systems will not solve the problem, because this is questionable, because we do have now a huge political background and constraints due to the European Green Deal and the so-called farm to fork strategy from the European Union, which is describing the pathway towards sustainable agriculture within the upcoming 20 years. That means 50% less agrochemicals, 50% less nutrient nutrient losses, and 20% less fertilizer input, and much more carbon sequestration and more agrobiodiversity. And the thesis from my side and from our group is this will not work anymore in specialized all arable systems. And the hypothesis is lay systems are the trigger towards a resilient integrated crop livestock system narrative. And this is a background for our Lindhof experimental research farm project, eco-efficiency of pasture-based milk production, which we started some 5 years ago. The idea behind that was also driven from my trip to New Zealand and Australia some 4 or 5 years ago, with a vision: if dairy cows have to leave the peat soils, how can we then contribute to resilient cropping systems in arable regions? That means, how can dairy systems make arable cropping better? And the vision we do have is bringing all ecosystem services together, because beyond the situation in New Zealand and in Australia, where you don't have the subsidies, we do have the subsidies from the European CAP, but the subsidies will much more link to environmental services and ecosystem services in the future. And that means we have to look for solutions which are bringing all these ecosystem services together and bring this data set then to the CAP and to the politicians to bring farmers into the benefit of these payments due to their environmental or ecological services they are delivering. And that means also, in my perspective, that we do have to question the paradigm of the current dairy systems in US and in Central Europe, which is called maximizing milk performance per cow in specialized systems based on concentrate feeding. And the complementary concept is close to Ireland, to New Zealand, and somehow also to Australia, maximizing milk yield per cow from, but now not from permanent grassland, but also from temporary grassland in integrated crop livestock systems plus ecosystem services. So what are we doing there? So we do have established a huge experiment some 4 or 5 years ago in this project, eco-efficiency of pasture-based milk production on the experimental farm Lindhof. We didn't have a dairy before that. We had a suckler cow herd, and then we looked for money and were quite successful. So we implemented a Jersey herd with 100 cows with a 150 hectare farm in an integrated crop livestock system. And the idea is to maximize milk performance from grass with low concentrate supplement in a mixed farming system, grazing 2 to 3 year lays from March till November. We use a Jersey breed, and it works very fine. We do have multi-species mixtures for homegrown proteins, yield stability, forage quality, carbon sequestration, and biodiversity. And we do have, and that's the most big advantage for the arable cropping, we do have a huge carbon and nutrient nitrogen transfer from the lay to the subsequent catch crop part of the crop rotation. And by so, we are enhancing the nitrogen use efficiency, and we try to look for win-win solutions for farmers, environment, and the society. So we do have a huge measurement program, and looking also for enhanced biodiversity by using these different seed mixtures. And the big advantage of lay systems compared to permanent grassland is that we can manipulate biodiversity in lay systems, because they have only survived for 2 or 3 years, and many of the species will survive during this time span, but they will not survive in a long time span in permanent grassland. So we compared in the last 3 years simple mixtures, threefold mixtures, and complex mixtures in terms of productivity, yield stability, and also in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And for this purpose, greenhouse gas emissions, we use the SF6 method, made a huge measurement experiment program during the last 2 years or 3 years. And the results were just published some months ago in Agriculture with the title Methane Emissions and Milk Production from Jersey Cows, Grazing Perennial Ryegrass, White Clover, and Multi-Species Forage Mixtures. And our idea and hypothesis behind this was, if we offer young grass in a rotational system with 9 to 10 rotations, with clover grass systems, with highest digestibility, we should be able to produce lowest methane emissions per kilogram of milk production. And you can see, yes, that works. We are able, without any huge amount of concentrate, to produce very, very low figures of methane emissions per kilogram of milk and to produce quite high milk yields from these dairy herds in this system. And that means we do not need all-in-barn confinement systems with a high amount of concentrates to produce low methane emissions per kilogram of milk. Intensively grazed multi-species lays ensure lowest methane emissions, and this is a result of highest energy and appropriate protein levels in herbage and offer, and thus cows are allowed in the grazing system to digest somehow concentrate feeding from grass clover pastures. This is also a result of progress in grass and clover breeding during the last decades also. So now let's come from the methane figures to the carbon footprint of milk. Before we started to derive the carbon footprint in a life cycle assessment from this project, we made a huge investment in a meta-analysis. Heike Lorenz from my group did so. So we analyzed all available literature worldwide regarding the differences of different production systems, confinement systems, intermediate systems, or full pasture-based systems regarding the carbon footprint. And you do see the main results from this analysis here, were published some 3 years ago. And you can see, if you have a pasture-based system, you do have a buffer of around 4,000 kilograms of milk production compared to a confinement system in terms of the carbon footprint. And our idea and our hypothesis was we should be able to be much better than this area here. We should be able to produce much lower carbon footprints when we integrate the dairy systems in an integrated crop livestock system, as I told you. So the hypothesis is that the inclusion of the benefits of lowest N2O emission, because we don't use any mineral fertilizer, only the legume nitrogen and the lake carbon sequestration, ends up in lowest carbon footprints from an integrated crop livestock system. Well, we did so by comparing in total 4 commercial dairy farms and used our Lindhof approach as somehow as a control for that. And I want to show you the direct comparison to the mainstream we do have for the time being in Germany and beyond, in the many states of Northwest Europe. All confinement systems, very, very high milk performance per cow, indoor year-round, only silages, and a high amount of concentrate feeding. And we are doing just the opposite, poor grazing, and we do have also very, very few input of concentrates, and we do feed this concentrate feeding not at the beginning of the lactation in the block calving system in spring, but from July, August onwards to buffer the high protein levels from the legume-based lay systems. Well, and here is a final and central result of this comparison. You do see on the x-axis the carbon footprint, and you do see on the y-axis the nitrogen budget, nitrogen balance in kilogram nitrogen per hectare. And this is the integrated pasture system from the Lindhof side, and on the other hand, we do have the high input situation here with the mainstream, and we had 2 other farms, but I don't go into detail with these. You can read that in the publication. So if we look to the poor figures, which seem to be very easy to understand. That is, we do have the high milk performance per cow here, the 11,000 kilo, as I already mentioned. And that means in total from the hectares of own land on the farm, this farm produces somehow 15 to 16,000 kilogram of milk. But the area which is needed for the concentrate feeding is not included here. This area is included in the land use efficiency. There we added all the area needed to produce soy, rapeseed, and wheat concentrate feeding. And then you end up finally with a land use efficiency of 1.2 square meter you need of worldwide forage area to produce 1 kilogram of milk. And we also derived the nitrogen footprint that makes some 12 grams of nitrogen per kilogram of milk in this situation, ending up with this very high nitrogen surplus per hectare here. And if you now look to the integrated crop livestock approach, where you export carbon and nitrogen from the late system to the following arable crop, we do have only some 72,000 kilos of milk production per cow here, and only 10,000 for forage area on farm, but we do not need additional forage area because we do not have any additional or very few additional concentrate feeding. And that means if you compare the land use efficiency of this system globally, we need 1.3 square meter per kilogram of milk, and the high intensive confinement systems need 1.2 square meter. And our nitrogen footprint is 5 gram and not 12 gram. And we are ending up then with 50 kilogram of surplus in total, and we are ending up with 0.63 kilogram of CO2 equivalents per kilogram of milk. And that makes very clear we do have a lot of options to bring together ecosystem services and low footprints of the dairy products in integrated livestock systems. That means, as a conclusion, lay-based milk production can be attributed with a very low carbon and nitrogen footprint, a high land use efficiency, and a significant contribution to more functional diversity in agriculture in general. And it is also attributed to very, very low nitrate leaching figures. We always find less than 20 ppm, and that means in total less than 15 kilogram of nitrogen leached under the systems. Because we do have very active rooting systems. We do have the tap roots from the chicory and from the red clover in these mixtures, and that means that we do have a very effective rooting system taking up all the nutrients. Well, what does it mean? The final conclusion. We do think, yes, we can show that resilient integrated crop livestock systems work. This narrative works based on lay systems plus pasture-based dairy for better environment. This works towards fulfilling the farm-to-fork challenges. And thus, we do think that this also needs political support in the future. And we are going on with the research. We have a lot of other papers already published regarding the N2O emissions, and the paper regarding the nitrate leaching is on the way and will be published within the next 3 months. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Fred. That was a really fantastic presentation. I will start off the questions. I think we've got we've got half an hour. You're actually under time, which is great. So the first, I have a couple of questions. The first is more around just clarification. You talk about like a lay system. Is that an annual crop or?
No, a lay system, if you look to the old literature, is coming originally from England. It came up from the history lay. After World War II in England, there was a movement of agricultural scientists towards integrated crop livestock systems and inclusion of grass clover lays, mostly based on perennial ryegrass, white clover, and red clover. And my experience that I received when I was in New Zealand and looked to all this experiment with plantain and with chicory and so on, then we decided, okay, we have to add all these additional species which might benefit also regarding ecosystem services. And that means we are looking for species that can be competitive in an intensive grazing situation for at least 2 years. So the idea is we do have an arable crop rotation, and they do have a lot of problems also regarding the nitrate directives from the European Union. Because if you look to a crop rotation with oilseed rape and winter wheat or winter wheat, then you mostly do exceed the 50 ppm threshold of net nitrate. And if we do have, on the other hand, the specialized dairy, they do have maize by maize by maize on the arable cropping. They do have also a lot of problems regarding nitrate leaching. If you now think forward, and we do have many regions where these two types of specialized systems are in a close neighborhood. And if they build up virtual mixed cropping farms, they are still managing their dairy herd, and they are still managing on the other side their arable fields, but they do have common crop rotations on their fields and include this 2 years of lays. This 2 years of lays produce more than 10 tons of dry matter, and you do have no nitrate leaching. So always less than 10 to 12, maximum 15 kilos. And if you do have 2 full years of production, they're very, very productive. You use all the breeding progress in perennial ryegrass in the last decades. And then you do have 3 winter times without any leaching. And then you can go on with producing oilseed rape and winter wheat. You can use the pre-cropping effects from the lay, which brings some 10% more yield, which is very well documented from the colleagues from France. It's very clear that we do have a huge benefit of this clover grass, temporary clover grass systems for the following crops in an arable rotation.
I think so that gives me a much better sort of understanding of the crop rotations that you have over there. The second question I wanted to ask you, and then I'll hand it over to the rest of the group to ask some questions, was around sort of the financial implications of these integrated livestock and cropping systems. So I'm not sure, like I'm not that familiar with the Green Deal and the subsidy sort of systems that you guys have over here. Being in New Zealand, we are unsubsidized. But what is there a financial benefit, or is it a tax? And in terms of like production, obviously going from an intensive system.
For the time being, we do have the so-called two pillow system. That means farmers receive subsidies in a range of around 200 to 250 euros per hectare. That means if you do have many hectares, then you receive a lot of money of subsidies. And this is under strong discussion also from the green parties and also from the environmental scientists, because we do not fulfill all the environmental issues we do have to fulfill. I showed you the figures regarding the nutrient balances, and we do implement, due to that high intensities, a high amount of social cost due to nitrogen surpluses. And therefore, the pressure to the farmers' associations from the politics is to produce more ecosystem service and to drop down this fixed payment for hectares and to couple that much more in the future to ecosystem services. This is the idea behind that, and the recent cap, which is now in the final discussions in the European Parliament, will go towards this direction. So the direct payment in the first pillar will be capped a little bit by 20%, something like that. And there will be more money available in the so-called second pillar for ecosystem services. And we are focusing on the second pillar. So with this project we are doing here, we can show the politicians, if you do it like this way, you will ensure that the environmental costs will be dramatically reduced. And this is the most important point, in my opinion, as an agricultural scientist, you do not lose productivity. That's the most important issue.
So effectively what you're saying is that farmers can sort of reduce the intensity of their systems and make the same sort of profit or more profit? Like, what does profitability look like in these farms?
So for the time being, you can estimate roughly that 50% of the net return for the farms come from the subsidies. But on the other hand, if you do not have own land but rented land, this subsidies is also already included in the price to rent land. So the really winner of the game is the landowner and not the farmer. And therefore, we have to switch more and more towards reducing these payments without any additional ecosystem services to be measured and to be documented. And that's the situation we are in for the time being, that the pressure from the environmental scientists, from the Green Party, is very, very strong to this movement, and is coming up from the European Commission with this farm to fork strategy, with the main figures I gave you in the introduction. And this is for me the driver to show, okay, if we want to have minus 50% of agrochemicals, well, it's the easiest way by doing so if we add this glass clover lace, not on the permanent grassland only, because we have to go off a lot of this permanent grassland of the peaty soils in the next 20 years, and we can switch the dairy herds towards this arable land, these arable regions, and make arable cropping better with less environmental pollution.
Yep.
Hi, Professor Tauble, Martin McIver from Washington State University. Whenever, great talk, thank you very much for your presentation. Whenever you were showing, I was thinking about the different systems, and here in the United States, there is a big pressure on the environmental impact of agricultural systems. Right now, the Environmental Protection Agency is putting a lot of pressure on the producers to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and to reduce the use of resources such as land and water. Do you measure your environmental impact in your studies? And if so, which system do you think is going to be the future in terms of having a happy medium between governments and producers?
Well, we did measure the last 20 years, nearly everything in this type of agriculture we do have here in the northern German area. So we measured all the nitrate leaching, we measured the N2O emissions, we measured the CO2 emissions from those systems. And well, the productivity and forage quality for sure as well, because we are always looking for solutions which can fulfill, well, the demand of the society, but ensure farmers' income. And we do see for the future, I call it, I have skipped that slide because I thought it might be too much, but we call it in the future hybrid agriculture. That means a mixture of organic and conventional systems. What I've shown you here, this is all from an organically managed dairy farm. And you do see regarding this clover grass mixtures and these lace systems, it works perfectly. We have a huge amount of forage. We do have forage qualities, which, well, in terms of energy content, exceed dramatically the energy content of maize, and we have additionally all the protein we need. So this part of the story works perfect. But if we would go on organic with another 3 years of all arable cropping, then we would fail, because then we produce a yield gap of more than 50%. And now we try to convince our Ministry of Agriculture from our state that he uses this money for the second pillar, which is coming now with a new cap, to give farmers motivations to start this hybrid agriculture. That means having 50% of the crop rotation with clover grass, for example, and following oat in spring, managed organically. We measure that. You do have a yield gap compared to conventional maize or conventional oats, not more than 20% maximum. And then you have another 3 crops in your crop rotation: classical, commercial, conventional, all-seed rape, and twice winter wheat. And then you make 4 or 5 tons of all-seed rape and 10 tons of winter wheat. And you don't have problems with resistance to insecticides and chemical herbicides and so on, because you do have a well-being and healthy crop rotation, which is not the case for the time being. So this is the idea we do have. And well, we do see nowadays that also the wider thinking farmers from the farmers associations, they are talking to us, they look for their ideas, and we make calculations. So what do we have to pay to those farmers if they switch to this hybrid system? I can add the slide also afterwards, and you can read it afterwards, what I mean with that in detail. We calculated, well, we have to give some 200, maybe 250 euros per hectare per year. So that's the money we do have anyway in the big bulb for the farmers. So if we use it into this direction, instead of paying it only for hectares, then we would have the benefits for the environment and also the benefits for the farmers. And for the time being, yes, I'm quite optimistic that this system will work also in a wider scale, because the pressure, on the other hand, is more organic farming. And I do not see that organic farming as a solution for all, because the yield gap is too huge if you look to the arable cropping systems. But if we would have some 15 or 20% of organic and maybe 20% of hybrid agriculture, then we would ensure that we do have a huge dilution effect in the landscapes regarding nitrate leaching and all the other environmental pollution.
Thank you.
Luke Delaby?
Yeah, hello. Hello, Friedhelm.
Yeah, hello.
I am Luc Delaby from France. How are you?
Yeah, look.
Nice to hear you today. Very good paper. And I have two questions. I have 2 questions, Friedhelm. The first one, do you remember the EGF meeting in Aberystwyth? We have proposed a part of your talk today with René Beaumont, and you were not so enthusiastic than today. And my first question is, have you changed a little bit? And the second one is, do you think that really the new cap will help to move in the hybrid and organic farming you proposed tonight?
Well, first of all, I mentioned the French story in my introduction, that we have a lot of experience and from Le Maire, and we had this very nice review paper 2 years ago from Le Maire regarding the lay systems and the benefits. Well, I cannot imagine that I was not enthusiastic about your paper, but anyway. Luke, we are totally convinced about this approach for sure. And well, regarding your second question, regarding the cap, well, I agree with you if you are a little bit reserved for the next 3 or 4 years. Yes, I agree with you, because the farmers' associations were, in my perspective, too successful with somehow going on with the old system. But we will have a midterm review 4 or 5 years ahead, and I'm really totally convinced that we then will do have a change, because this farm to fork strategy and all these issues regarding the Green Deal, the pressure regarding the reduction of CO2 emissions is that huge that they will have to jump to the other side. I'm quite sure about that. And you know, we do have now the situation, at least in Germany, that was decided 2 weeks ago, that there will be much more money available in the second pillar. That means money which can be used for those specific strategies which we were discussing here. And so the perspective is positive. In the short term, I agree with you, Luke. I think that was the background of your question, that we wanted much more. We wanted to have all the money in the pool now to be given for environmental performances and for ecosystem services given by farmers. But the lobby, the agricultural lobby, is still very powerful, and so it goes more stepwise.
No, that's right. I agree, in fact. But I think that at the moment, we are in the middle of the bridge, and we have to transform. And it's not so easy to transform the New Deal idea at the moment, but probably you're right. We need maybe 5 years, 10 years to transform.
I think maybe for the colleagues from New Zealand and Australia, this is very, very far away because you do not have this subsidy system. But so the subsidy system makes a lot of problems. That's clear. But on the other hand, you do have somehow a pressure to switch to a better system, and that gives also pressure regarding the fertilizer legislation. We do have now a new fertilizer legislation in Germany since 3 years. In the paragraph 1 of the fertilizer legislation. That means, so why do we fertilize? There is, well, a paragraph, we are fertilizing so that the crops can grow and so on, which we know all from the history. But then we do have a new paragraph 4. Why do we fertilize? And paragraph 4 means to minimize losses to the environment. So that is in paragraph 1 of the amendment and in the legislation. And that means that gives a huge pressure also regarding the fertilizer legislation. And we are, for the time being, in strong discussions about that. We will come in with a farm gate balance and with maximum thresholds regarding the farm gate balance. And for you in New Zealand, to give you that figures, because I know also the figures from the nitrogen farm gate budgets there, from the dairy farms, they are not always convincing, to be honest, to me. If we are here on an arable farm, 5 years ahead, an arable farm is allowed to produce some 35 kilos of surplus, 35 kilos per hectare, not more. And an all dairy farm, 5 years ahead, is allowed to produce 90 to 100 kilogram of nitrogen surplus. And gross surplus, not net, not some unavoidable losses subtracted or something like that. And this is a pressure we are building up now to ensure that these systems, which I showed you, that they come into progress, and then it will work. If the pressure from the nitrogen fertilization amendment is there, then we will come up with this program. And that is our idea behind that we are bringing that into the agricultural practice and to the politicians to push these ideas.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Fred. The next question that I had was around the grazing management that you used in your integrated systems. So from what I can kind of gather, it's a 9-month grazing period, and you said somewhere between 9 to 10 grazings per season. So is it 3 to 4 weeks sort of interval between grazings? What is the basis behind that?
The basis behind that is a very intensive rotational system. So we do have at least one cut per year we take off. We are producing bale silage for the winter feeding. And that means we do have in total some 24 paddocks, and the cows are grazing at a maximum 1 day at one paddock. We use all these techniques which are Luke and all the others already brought in during the last 50, 20 years, rising plate meters and all these issues. So we offer always three fully developed leaves, and that means less than 1,000 kilo per hectare. And then we do have 9 to 10 grazing cycles depending on the weather conditions. We do have in total some 780 millimeters of precipitation per year and an average temperature of some 8.1 degrees. So if we look to the temperature sum, it's just the same as in Southern Ireland, more or less the same figures for that. And the big benefit of this lay system is we do have always a clover grass system in the first full production year and the second full production year. So in the first full production year, we do have much more clover. And that means during the night grazing, our herd manager has a herd always in the second grazing year. Then we do have more grass, and there we can avoid blood due to this higher share of grasses and lower share of legumes. And then we do have always then we do have 2.5 years of this lay system, and then we follow with the oats. And then we do have 2 winter crops, winter wheat or triticale, something like that. Mostly triticale is the last crop in the 6-year crop rotation. And in the triticale, we do have then the grass clover understory. So we do all establishment with understories, and that works very fine in organic, you know. And that means that if we do have wet conditions in May and June, we do have to cut the ears of the winter wheat quite high, because the red clover is close to the ears of the winter wheat or of the triticale. And then we do have, from this understory, we do have already in autumn 2 to 3 grazing cycles, and therefore we can totally compensate the reduced dry matter increment per day in late summer and autumn, because we do have now this additional intercrop, this additional establishment year of the clover grass. And I really do think, after I have seen the southern island of New Zealand and the history of the southern island of New Zealand, which was dryland agriculture till 15 or 20 years ago. And I do really think that this idea is also an idea to reduce these environmental problems with too much nitrate leaching and too much nitrate surplus per hectare, by doing so to have a specific share of oilseed rape and also cereals back in the crop rotations, and making thus, on your current situation, the dairy systems better.
Yeah, absolutely. There are actually some sort of similar systems sort of starting to be implemented in New Zealand, and the use of sort of diverse pasture species to try and reduce nitrogen leaching, and certainly catch crops are something that we utilise in New Zealand following winter grazing. Paulo Cavallo, do you have a question?
Yes, please. Hi, Friedhelm.
Hi.
Nice to see you. Thanks for your talk. Thanks for your talk. I really appreciate. My question is about integrated crop livestock systems adoption. And this is, well, I'm really convinced about the benefits of integrated crop livestock systems, for sure. But
well, I learned a lot from you in Porto Alegre from that systems also.
It's kind of you, thanks. But the question is, if farmers to adoptions, if you really think it's only a matter of subsidies, or because in many countries there is a lack of technical advising of these kind of systems. It's very complex. It's much more complex systems. So how would you please make comments about this?
Yeah, so the most interesting point for me is that all arable farmers came to us, to Lindhof, and looked to that system. And they mentioned, well, we have to recognize we try to solve the problems we do have with weeds and pests only by technical solutions, but going on with our specialized system. And now after 20 or 25 years of doing so, and it's the same in the southeast of England, yeah, they do have a lot of problems with weeds in all winter wheat cropping and so on. It's the same here. They do not have any more access to all the insecticides. They do not have any more access to herbicides which work against grass weeds. They do have a lot of problems with grass weeds here. And therefore, they are looking for solutions. So it won't work everywhere. That's clear. If you do have a landscape where you do not have any dairy cow, the dairy cow won't come back. But we do have a lot of landscapes where, as I mentioned, where we do have somehow neighborhood conditions between all arable farmers here and dairy farmers there. And if they come together to build up a virtual mix farm, then it's a part of a solution. And well, we have to make recommendations. We have to try to convince them, but you are aware about that worldwide. We need also some obligations and some pressure in terms of, for example, fertilizer amendments and fertilizer legislation. So a little bit of pressure is necessary. And then I'm quite convinced that it will work. So the far forward-looking farmers are all absolutely interested in these solutions, and that makes me quite optimistic. You do have always some farmers which are very, very conservative and who don't want to switch. But I'm convinced that the combination of recommendation, extension services, and some pressure will work.
All right, do we have any more questions from the group?
Good Abend, Friedhelm. Thank you for
Hi, Ina. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you. A quick question about the comparison between grass clover lays and those multi-species swaths. What differences do you see between these two?
Well, I can send you also the paper. It was published last year in Sustainability. So our hypothesis was that we could produce more feed and that maybe also the forage quality and especially also the methane emissions were reduced. But we did not see that. So we did have a higher dry matter intake from the multi-species mixture by some 10%. That was 1.6 kilos, something like that. Enhanced dry matter intake per dairy cow. We had more or less the same energy content in megajoule metabolizable energy, but we did have also some 8 to 10% higher methane emissions per kilogram of milk. So at the end of the story, no, not per kilo, it was the same, sorry. But in total, we had some 10% more methane emissions. So per kilogram of milk, we did have the same figures. So more dry matter intake, more milk production, but also in the same proportion, more methane emissions. And regarding the forage production, we did not see a significant difference, but what we did see over a 4-year period with one very wet year in that period and one very, very dry year in that period, that the yield stability was totally enhanced, significantly enhanced. That means all these additional species with a taproot, they ensured that we did have always available herbage on offer during the summer months, while the white clover grass mixture dropped down in the productivity and did not offer any more herbage on offer. So that was the main outcome. That is a paper that was published from Heike Lorenz also in Sustainability last year. If you look to our homepage, you can see all the recent publications, and you can get access also.
Well, I do have another one, if I may.
Oh, yep, go ahead.
Going on about what Paolo was asking about adoption as well. Friedhelm, you're very clear that you think there will only be change if there are legislations or subsidies in place. What do you think might be the way then for countries like New Zealand, where we do not have any of these positive legislations?
Well, the huge advantage, let me start this way, the huge advantage of us working in universities is that we are totally independent and we can really talk about what we think. And I was very impressed about the systems in New Zealand when I visited these wonderful countries some 3 years ago. But to be honest, I was also shocked somehow about the intensity and the problems regarding environmental pollution. I know that there is a switch also in New Zealand, but I'm quite sure that on the worldwide market for dairy products, we will see a development from those who are buying products from New Zealand or from Europe in China and elsewhere. They will in the future look much more not only to product quality, but also to process quality. And that means they will look to these figures. What is the nitrogen footprint? What is the carbon footprint of the dairy products on the world markets? And I think regarding this, there will come up a huge pressure in Europe. It comes from the organic branch, because the organic branch gets another subsidies. I mentioned to you the normal farmer gets for the time being from the first pillow around 250 euros per hectare. And if you switch to organic, you get another 250 to 300 euro per hectare, depending on the country you are working in. And all the measurement programs show, yes, they produce less, but the environment problems are diminishing. And due to this evidence, it's quite clear that we have to go to this hybrid production systems, because all the dairy industries, they know about that. Also, Friesland Campina in the Netherlands, Ina, they know that they will have to switch the systems, especially on the peaty salts, because it will not be acceptable in 10 years to produce milk on land which produces some 50 tons of CO2 emissions per year, when the price for 1 ton of CO2 emission is 100 euro or more. So it won't work in the future. And therefore, I'm quite sure that there will come up a competition between the dairy industry, the big companies in Europe, that they will advertise their progress in this field. And this all together will make the switch run, or the transformation work.